Okay, that makes 2 o'clock Eastern, which means noon Mountain Time, which means it's starting time for the webinar today. I just want to thank everyone yet again for joining in to our webinar series. Today's topic is going to be on Aia Style Invoicing, which is definitely one of the most popular topics when it comes to using Knowify. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Terrin Kalian. I have been working with Knowify for 5 years and am the director of our customer experience team. So basically, anything that has to do with Knowify and people using Knowify, I'm going to have my hands in it somewhere along those lines. And just to give you a little bit of an overview on what we're covering in today's webinar. First, I just want to, at a high level, beyond Knowify, give you guys a little bit more information about what Aia style invoicing is. For those of you who use it often, it's probably just going to be a refresher, not any additional information you need. But a lot of people, have heard a lot about AIA invoicing, and they just want to learn more about, what is this, invoicing style that has become so popular in the past couple of years. I'll also show you briefly how to enable this in your account in case it's something that you don't have in your account to date. It's a very simple setting in your admin section. And then, in our actual demonstration, I'll be showing you how to set up a project for AIA invoicing and how to then invoice that project. That'll also include how to invoice the retainage for a project. Obviously that's a big part of AIA invoicing is tracking the retainage and how much basically needs to be billed to the customer, how much they're withholding at any point in time. And as always, we'll be ending this series with a Q&A just to give you a little bit more information on anything I didn't cover. Again, feel free to submit questions while I'm going through the demonstration part of this webinar. And then we'll also do the Q&A at the end. So if you have the question mid-demo, go ahead and submit it. If it only comes up at the end, you can submit it then. I'll be answering every question that's submitted into Zoom's Q&A section. But first, I want to talk about, what is AIA style invoicing? I'm just going to pull up my account here. But basically, AIA invoicing is an invoice style that was developed by the American Institute of Architects to communicate to your customer how far along you are on the project. A lot of people are familiar with the idea of progress invoicing, but what AIA invoicing is doing a little bit differently is telling a little bit more of the story beyond here's the percentage of the contract that we've invoiced to date. It's saying here's how much we're requesting out of our contract value, but here's also what we're requesting it for. And that's when we'll get into more detail on things like, stored materials when we're creating our AIA style invoices. And a lot of you may also be familiar with the other terminology, which is the G702 and G703 form, which is the actual invoice document that is generated when you're doing AIA invoicing. But now back to Knowify. Just to show you how to turn this on in your account in case you don't have it enabled yet, I can go to my admin section. I can come to customize. And one of our first settings up here, AIA style invoicing, also known as pay applications. And this can just be enabled here. It's going to ask about default invoicing style. I'm going to walk through what each of these does when I'm creating my invoice, my first invoice in this demonstration. So you'll get a little bit more information about this. But for referring back to later on, once you know which of these is the correct style for you, you can come to your admin section and make it so Knowify automatically starts on the invoicing style you want, so you don't have to reset this whenever you're creating a new invoice. But first, I'm going to set up the actual contract in Knowify. And I'll do that just like any other job. I'll come and say add new contract job, project 1751. This information not as relevant. This is just classic Knowify demo. And once we have that setting turned on in our admin section, you can see that we have fixed price with Aia Billing as one of our contract styles. Now, setting up these contracts is actually almost identical to setting up our standard fixed price contracts. So if you're familiar with this type of contract in Knowify, it doesn't require too much extra knowledge to set these up as well. Uh, Next, it's asking about job costing style. Again, I won't get into too much detail because that's more classic Knowify, but you do have the option to select between these three options as opposed to cost plus where you're defaulted to advanced. Since we're only focusing on AIA billing and not the whole budget bid track invoice flow of Knowify, I'm going to choose simple. Simple is always the best option if you're mainly focused on the contract in Knowify and you're not as concerned about detailed job cost reporting. I'll go ahead and set an address because I always do, and I'll save this job. Now, the first thing that we're going to be setting up here is our, we'll call it the bid in Knowify. And this is going to be just the total value that I'm quoting to my client when they request for a bid. Say, I need you to do X, Y, and Z, and I send back, here's how much we can get this done for. There's information like who are you sending this bid to? I always use my example of Hector Zeroni. If they sent a request for proposal reference number, you can put that in so it can be included in your proposal or your bid that goes out. Again, you can always write in a description of the project, but this is where everything's really going to come into play when we're actually setting up the bid, and that's going to be building a series of line items. So for those of you who are familiar with the AIA invoicing process, this is really going to be where we're building our schedule of values. And I'm going to show you later on how this doesn't have to be a final schedule of values. If you're truly using Knowify to send out your bids, get that e-signature like we have nice and built in, but then the customer sends you a different schedule of values that they want you to invoice along, we have a feature for that, and I'll cover that a little bit later in this demonstration. But I'm going to start really simple. I'm going to make a 3 line item contract where I'll say, rough-in, we're going to do this for $4,000, installation for $7,000, and I'll call this finishing for $3,000. If you want more detailed information on building out contracts, I highly recommend checking out our webinar from earlier this week. It'll be on YouTube eventually, where we just covered general creation of fixed price contracts. But again, today I really want to focus more on AIA invoicing, so I'm not going to spend too much time building out bids and showing that type of detail. For what it's worth, I will show you that this does generate a very similar document to our standard fixed price proposal. It just includes the pricing. So when you send this to the customer, they're looking at this 14,000. They're probably interested in your breakdown, but this is going to be their main priority a lot of the time. I'll skip the e-signature and just go ahead and make this active. So what we can do now is start the actual process of building out AIA invoices. Now, one thing that is different between the standard fixed price and the AIA in Knowify is that before you create invoices, you do need to fill in a couple last fields, which are GC contract number and contract date, and then if necessary, retainage. I'll go ahead and fill these in. I'll put in the date of the GC's contract. I'll put in the retainage. And once I save this, now we're ready to start building out our invoices for this AIA job. Just like any other job, pretty straightforward. I click Invoice Now. But you'll see that right off the bat, it's different from your normal invoicing screen in Knowify, where it's going to first ask us for the date of the billing period. Now, basically, it's saying, what date are you invoicing for all of the work done through? So if I am invoicing for everything that I've done up until today, I could say the 27th, but I can also say, well, this invoice is actually for everything I've done through the month of August. So I'm going to choose the 31st. And I'm basically saying some of the money that I'm requesting in this pay application is for work that I haven't done yet. Now, when we set this up, the default invoicing style is going to be completed work in a percentage, classic progress invoicing, and stored materials in dollars. This is the most common way we see people invoicing for the AIA format. And the idea is that I can say my rough in, I'm 50% complete with it, and I'm holding on to $1,000 in materials. The other option here is that if we want, we could do the whole thing in dollars. Sometimes people like to get more exact with their numbers, and the percentage may round differently than they want, or anything along those lines. So this option of enter completed work in dollars and stored materials in dollars just gives you a little bit more control over the exact number you're billing if you need that. And then a lot of people don't even use the stored materials. They just find that their customers like the AIA format and they just want to manage, percentage of completion. This last option doesn't even do classic progress invoicing, because I would just say, we want to bill $1,000. And it's just a simpler way for me to write in, how much I want to bill out of each line item to date. And then, in our classic progress invoicing, we would come back to this, and to bill the next $1,000, I would say 2,000 to say the total completed, to date. But in this case, I'm truly just invoicing, the exact number that I want to bill in this period. I'll just plug that in. But I'm going to do this whole demonstration in the percentage complete and the stored materials in dollars, kind of our, as I keep calling it, the classic format for AIA invoicing. Now, when I say stored materials, and this is something that I find is often not the clearest thing on this form. We're not talking about, oh, well, this is how much we're billing for how much we spent on materials, and here's how much is labor. Because at the end of the day, you want completed work to finish out at 100%. To show that you've completely finished the work on this line item. But the amount of completed work plus stored materials can't exceed the amount that you have quoted to the customer. So basically, we are going to end up in this situation where when I invoice stored materials, let's say I am invoicing $4,000 in stored materials. This means that later on, I'm going to take this balance and I'm going to move it into the completed work as I use these materials. So basically what you're doing in stored materials is saying, here's money that I'm requesting, but I'm not telling you that I've done the work. I'm just saying, here's some money I would like upfront to start the job. And before I get into too much detail on that, I'm actually going to create an invoice just so you could see in a little bit more detail what I'm referring to here. Where I'll say this is 25% complete and we're holding on to 2,000 materials. And this one, I'm going to say half of it's stored materials, but we haven't started the work. And I'll go ahead and finalize this. Now, one thing I'd like to note is that you see Knowify automatically is calculating that 10% retainage here. So it's technically a $6,500 invoice, but it's saying, well, we're actually only requesting 5,850 and 650 is being retained. I'll go ahead and verify and finalize this invoice. And then I'll pull up a preview of it. And I'm just going to download this PDF and blow it up here just to make it a little bit more readable. Now, the first page here is going to be our G702. This is just breaking down, the summary. This cover sheet is just to, get the, lump sum total information that you want to, communicate to the client. The most important value here is this line 8, row 8, where we're saying right now we're requesting $5,850. But what I'm going to get into next is going to be the schedule of values, our G703, which shows us more about what's going into that $5,850. Now, columns A and B, pretty straightforward, is just saying first item, description of that item. Column C is saying, here's the amount that we agreed upon for this specific item. So rough in, you signed off on paying us $4,000 when all of this has been completed. D and E kind of play off of each other. This is saying how much has been completed in the past. Since this is our first invoice, it makes sense that all of this is set to 0. And it's saying that right now I'm invoicing, or I'm saying, we have completed $1,000 worth of work out of this $4,000. Now, even though we're invoicing $3,000 total out of rough in, you can see that this period is only saying 1,000 completed, 2,000 stored, which adds up to that 3,000. And so at the end of the day, it's important to note that information only, or numbers only, go into column E when it's actually work that you're communicating to the client. We have done this work. This isn't just about how much you're invoicing. You're actually telling the customer, we have completed, in this case, 1,000 out of the 4,000, so a quarter of the work. But we've invoiced 75% of the item because we're holding on to $2,000 in materials that we haven't used yet. The percentages are just to show the customer, how much of each line item has been billed. This shows the remaining balance of each item, and then how much is being retained to date. And again, one of the common questions we have are people saying, well, they expect one of these values, maybe the work completed this period, to add up to this current payment due. And again, because materials stored isn't factored into the amount that's been completed, you'll never see, if you're using stored materials, you'll very rarely see that this period total equal out the current payment due if everything's being done correctly. Also beyond that, retainage will also be deducting values from here, so it's another thing to note. So that's kind of what goes into the schedule of values on an invoice. And if I go back to this project now, I'll actually see that in the summary tab reported as our revenue to date is actually including retainage. And because basically, even though the customer isn't going to be paying us this 650 yet, it's still earned revenue. They're just withholding it until the project has been completed. Once the job's done, I will acquire this $650. It may take a couple of messages to the client to communicate, okay, we're done with the project, jobs have done great, please pay us the money that you're withholding. But we recognize it as revenue because we want the revenue to really show how far along you are on the project, to give you a better idea of your profitability when we run things like work in progress reports. So that's the basics of creating a first AIA invoice. But one thing I'm going to do is actually delete that invoice that we created, because I mentioned the idea of your schedule of values that the customer requests may not line up perfectly with the different line items that you had quoted to the customer. So I'm going to go back to this contract, and I lumped it together as rough in, installation, finishing. But let's say they actually consider rough in and installation to be one item. I can edit schedule values and merge these. And now I can invoice as 2 line items instead of the 3. I can also add items as well, where I could say, actually, what they do is rough in, where I'll say rough in downstairs was 2,000. Then they had another item called rough in upstairs, also 2,000. And so I can get a little bit more granular with this. I can group items together. And it basically just lets me adjust the value of the contract, or specifically the schedule values, to match what the customer wants to see when I actually send the invoices to them. And one thing we do just to help you keep track of all of this, if I go down to this summary at the bottom, I can see now that the original bid sum, the amount that I initially bid to the customer, matches my contract sum. So it's basically just confirming that the balance of the contract once they've adjusted the schedule values truly matches the 14,000 that I quoted to the customer. So let's say that they accidentally told me, 4,000 on finishing. It's going to give me this little red warning that says, actually, these two don't line up. And it gives me, it gives me that additional knowledge I need to communicate with the customer and say, where should we be taking that $1,000 out of this? Maybe you wouldn't communicate because you want the extra $1,000. Not exactly the same, but similar to, adjusting your line items. This is also the screen where you would be adding change orders. And we do have a webinar coming up next month that's specifically on change order management, but just so you can see what this is going to look like on the AIA form, if I could say something like upgraded lighting package for an additional $3,000. And again, these are always available for e-signature. This is going to be included in our schedule of values as well in the change order section of our G703. So I'll show you more about how that works. And kind of a side note here, you can see that we are showing at this point schedule values. If I ever need to refer back to my original bid to see what I quoted to the client, I can click that view original bid and see the initial pricing that I had quoted to the customer as it becomes relevant. Now, when I'm creating my invoice, you can see that it adds all of my new lines for my schedule values in here. And what I'm going to do is plug in, I'm going to do this first invoice in a mix of stored materials and our completed work, where like I'll say the upstairs materials, we want to invoice the entire item. And this one I'm also, for the downstairs, I'm also invoicing the entire item. So this is an important thing to note. I'm going to actually preview here so I can kind of go through different scenarios. You can see that in the rough-in for the downstairs, I'm invoicing 2,000. In the rough-in for the upstairs, I'm invoicing 2,000. But this upstairs item won't actually be closed out until we've taken that $2,000 and moved it into the work completed column. And when we do that, it doesn't actually request any additional money. So even though it's going to show up as work completed $2,000, we've already invoiced it in the past. So you can kind of think of it as crediting back a deposit that was paid earlier. Often when I'm teaching stored materials internally, we always refer to it as a type of deposit because it's a way to request money without actually doing work, so you can have the money to help you do the work more easily. I'll enter in a couple other invoice lines here, 50% here, 1,500 here, and then we'll do a couple that just aren't completely done. And I'll also add to I'll invoice the entire change order. So just to show you again a little bit more about what these are going to look like, it shows our payment to date. And it's going to show me the percentage of the entire line item that we've invoiced to date. And it's going to show us our change orders on a separate line, so we can see how far along we are with our change orders as well. Just separates it out, easier for the customer to see that way. Now I'm going to get into making a final invoice on this job, and eventually after that, invoicing retainage. So when I click invoice now again, and I'm just going to randomly choose a date period. Before I create this final invoice, I want to show you what I was referring to earlier. So you can see that rough-in downstairs is complete. We've invoiced completed work 100%, we're set. But what I may end up doing is taking this $2,000, reducing it to 0, saying that I've no longer stored materials on this. And here's a nice little warning that Knowify gives you if you are going outside of the AIA invoicing flow. It's basically saying these lines can't be 0 because you've already invoiced 2,000. At a bare minimum, they need to add up to 2,000, which in this case is 100% of the line item. Now you can see that I moved that $2,000 from here to here. So if I preview this PDF, it should be showing that nothing's actually being requested at this point in time. It's just moving information from stored materials to work completed on this pay application. And so that's kind of the workflow that we expect to see. Same thing goes for items that were partially billed. Again, if this goes from here to here, even though it's moving the work completed from 50% to 100%, it's not actually going to be invoicing any additional value because we already collected that money as materials stored on our last application. And that's the type of workflow I like to really demonstrate here, is that when dollars go from material stored to work completed, you're not actually requesting money. You're just telling the customer, now in column E, yes, we have completed this work to date. But just to wrap things up here, I'm going to invoice the remaining balance of this contract. And if you want, you can actually uncheck this box. You can see as soon as we get to 100% on one of these, I'm going to change this to 99 just to make it hide. And then I'm going to get to 100. It gives us the option to invoice retainage separately, which we find is the most common option. But if your customer is okay with you including retainage in your last application, if I uncheck that and finalize, I'll see that it's removing the amount from my retained to date and adding it to my payment due. But again, I'm actually going to be keeping retainage as part of this invoice, finalizing this. And now if I go back to the project, I'll see that everything has technically been invoiced in that the contract has been completely invoiced. But the last thing we need to do is create a invoice for the amount that's been retained. So I'll come to my summary really quickly just to demonstrate this so I can get the figures. But I can see that we've billed 15,300, but 1,700 is being retained by the customer. So I'm not done with this job quite yet. All I have to do is come back to my contract, and you'll see that the button now reads invoice retainage now because we've invoiced the rest. And it even shows me how much is being retained. And it'll generate a standard style Knowify invoice because we're no longer, communicating how far along we are with the project. We're just getting the money that we've earned in the past and the customer has been withholding from us. And it just creates the classic invoice document. You may have seen this in our time and materials webinar, but this just creates a retainage invoice. But I'm not going to finalize this invoice. I'm going to go back to my contract and bring up one of the more popular questions in Knowify, which is, how do I create my retainage invoice, but do it on an AIA form instead of a standard invoice form? If I come back to my contract and change retainage to 0, I can actually invoice the amount being retained on a AIA pay application. I'll just do the same thing, invoice now, and you'll see it doesn't switch invoice format. So I can do it just like I was doing earlier, no longer invoicing retainage separately. It's removing that amount from the invoice. Yeah, I messed something up here, but it would invoice the retainage using the AIA pay application instead of using the standard invoice document. So that's always a solution as well. Oh, I see. We still had a retainage draft because I saved it. That is my mistake. Another thing that's a common question is, what if I have to invoice my retainage midway through the project? You can actually, so we originally had 10% retainage on this project. And let's say I now have been given the green light to invoice half of it. I can come in here and change these values to 5% instead of 10%. And then when I create my retainage invoice, I should probably be refreshing more often, but then when I create my retainage invoice, it's not creating it for the total amount of the retainage. It's not waiting on my next invoice. It's just going to give me the option of invoicing that half of the retainage that I've now reduced when I went from 10 to 5%. So that's always an option as well. And I forgot, because this is completely billed, still going to try to create the retainage invoice, but I'll go ahead and just finalize that and move forward. If we get anything in the Q&A that wants to demonstrate the half retainage billing, I'm happy to go back on that as well. And now again, if I look at my reporting, it's actually going to be showing me how much has been billed to date, and there's no longer anything retained because I created my retainage invoice. That's everything I wanted to show for my demonstration. Now I'll get into the fun Q&A portion of these webinars, and let's see what we have today. If I had created the contract as fixed price, can I switch it to fixed price with AIA invoicing? Very good question. Another one that's very popular. And what I'm going to do is just create another one of these really quickly and actually create it as fixed price, just for a good example here. For those of you who aren't familiar with this copy from spreadsheet feature, here's another thing that can be done to create a schedule of values, because a lot of times we'll find that customers will send you a list of line items and say, can you please invoice along this schedule of values? So if you have that CSV from the customer, it's an easier way to import. Once the contract's saved as fixed price, if you haven't created any invoices yet, in fact, I'll make this one active just for the sake of being a little bit more exact with this quick Q&A. I come back to draft mode, I switch to draft. And again, you can't have invoices or change orders when you switch to draft, so you may need to clear some other data out. And then I have this button that says switch to AIA billing. And now this is an AIA job instead, and I can make it active again. The next question was, does this AIA invoice have an invoice number or just the payout number? To sync to probably to QuickBooks, will it require an invoice number? Very good question. So all of the invoices have both. We start new pay application numbering on every job, of course. So if I go back to this other job I had been working on, I can see GC invoice. It's my Knowify / QuickBooks invoice 2029, application 1, 2030, application number 2. So you always have two different numbers. If you ever have a need to have the internal, the Knowify / QuickBooks invoice number displayed on your invoices, let us know and we're happy to set that up for you. But they're always possible. There's a question, does AIA style invoice document sync through QuickBooks? Will it have the same look, or should I print it and email it to the client separately? So QuickBooks doesn't have AIA invoicing. It's something that's only possible in Knowify at this point in time. So in Knowify, it's going to have the look of an AIA format. The thing that gets sent to QuickBooks is just the value of each line that you're invoicing to date. And so basically in QuickBooks, it's just, a normal QuickBooks invoice. So you would have to create the PDF and email it through Knowify. There was a follow-up question to switching from fixed price to AIA. And it was, how do I switch then from AIA to standard fixed price? Same exact workflow. You just delete your invoices if you have any, switch to draft, and that same button that said switch to AIA will say switch to standard instead. And the last question said, you're doing great, Terrin, and I appreciate that. So thank you for the positive feedback. Just as closing, we're going to be pausing these webinars for 2 weeks and picking them back up in mid-September. With the Labor Day and other holidays coming up, we just figure, we'll give everyone a little bit of time to digest all the information we've been sending your way. And, we'll be jumping right back in, sending you emails with the registration links to jump back in. Thanks everyone again for taking the time to join, and I hope you all have a nice rest of your day.